Hello, and thank you for joining me in worship. It's a privilege to speak to you. A text from Exodus chapter 1, and it's verse 8. Then a new king, to whom Joseph meant nothing, came to power in Egypt. New beginnings will always be a feature of life in every sphere of our existence. In the Methodist Church, we will shortly begin another connectional year. We welcome an incoming minister to the Ipswich circuit, just as we have said goodbye to another who has moved away to retire. It's almost a year since the death of a woman who was widely respected by many, even those who could not necessarily subscribe to the ancient system of monarchy that she represented. Queen Elizabeth II had celebrated a platinum jubilee, and now, when we say Queen, we mean a different person entirely. It isn't that we disrespect her, it is that times have changed. And then a new king, to whom Joseph meant nothing, came to power in Egypt. However much we aspire to hang on to memories, especially happy ones, or to learn lessons from the past, achieving that is more easily said than done. Memory fades and people change. That does not diminish what has been, but it sets it at a distance. In my business life, I was recently involved in some discussions about how best to keep alive corporate memory, where important lessons from past successes and failures should not be forgotten. In the discussion, which reached no sensible conclusion about how to achieve such a miracle of the triumph of hope over experience, I recalled the wise words of the German philosopher Georg Hegel, who said, "The only thing we learn from history is that we learn nothing from history." But is it as bleak as that? The book of Exodus begins with a reminder of the names of the 11 sons of Jacob, or the sons of Israel, who joined their brother Joseph in Egypt at a time of famine. Joseph was literally a lifesaver for many people in extreme times. The twist in the tale is that the 11 brothers to whom Joseph was a genius and who had the foresight to store food in times of plenty, had no idea who he was. They had disposed of him to traders as a pain in the neck. But later, of course, they had to eat humble pie as well as benefiting from the rest of his stored food. Then came a new generation of people in Egypt. Memory was short, and the new regime saw not a lifesaver, but a population of immigrant impostors who were breeding fast and seemingly about to take over. So the newly crowned Pharaoh thought it a good plan to oppress the Israelites by making them slaves. There's a cross-reference to this verse in Exodus, and you can find it in Acts chapter 7. There, Stephen, about to be stoned to death for his faith, is recounting the story of the Jews, and specifically, apropos the new Pharaoh, says in verse 18, "Then the new king, to whom Joseph meant nothing, came to power in Egypt. He dealt treacherously with our people." So, an almost exact quote with a comment. Something of an understatement, perhaps, but then the Sanhedrin, the Jewish council, was framing up to deal treacherously with Stephen. But go back to Egypt. Kill the male children was the instruction given. The Egyptian midwives failed, whether deliberately because they were women and mothers themselves and couldn't bring themselves to be part of such awful slaughter, or whether genuinely the Hebrew mothers did give birth easily is something you can think about for yourself. We're told it's the latter, but there's part of me that hopes there was some of the former in play as well. A boy was born, his name was Moses, and the nature of his miraculous journey via a basket hidden in rushes by the river to the home of Pharaoh's daughter is a remarkable tale of escape. Moses was to become the man who led the beleaguered Hebrews from Egypt to safety under the guidance of God. The reading from Exodus sets the scene for a sea change in the lives of the people of God. They were settled in Egypt, but they would have to move on. They were oppressed in Egypt and would have to move on. Their history, written at this time, would become a great tradition, handed down from generation to generation, part of the story, part of the Passover, still part of what we remember when we celebrate Holy Communion. From here would develop law and prophets. From here would begin a story of obedience to God and disobedience to God at different times as circumstances changed. Of course, if we look critically at history, by doing it, we prevent ourselves from getting into ruts, from just going on and on in the same old way. But if we learn lessons from history, we also prevent wounds. We avoid the same mistakes. But if we hang on too much to history and tradition, we also prevent progress. It's a mixture, isn't it? And in this, as in all things, balance is so important. Yes, the age of Joseph had gone. The glory days in Egypt were over and it was time to start afresh, albeit in trying circumstances and for the wrong reasons. In the Gospel passage, Peter was the disciple prepared amongst the other disciples to look for something new. When many thought that Jesus was most likely a returned character from their tradition, from their history, Peter saw a Messiah. He saw through the repetition to the coming to pass of prophecy. He saw a new leader, and he saw a leader greater than Moses. And what he saw was tradition about to be overturned and yet built on. He saw wound dressing on a grand scale, and he saw progress like never before in the development of God's people. But what of our time now? Leaders and governments change around us. In our circumstances, the background is different from other people's. As you look at our diverse world, and we can see much more of the world than the people in Peter's or Moses' days could, the risk for us is different from the risk facing people in other continents and countries. And here it's not so much of slavery and oppression, not the risk of overstability from traditions, as ignorance of the lessons of the past, and the risk of going back beyond all of it to a new sort of slavery, a slavery to godless doubt and deep darkness. And yet an enlightened people who keeps asking questions. Surely we can't fall into that mistake, into that trap. But then again, perhaps the risk is really the same. Forgetting the blessings, forgetting those who questioned and challenge, not realizing that they have a valid part to play in our development and targeting them in a way that is really quite unpleasant, vilifying those who remind us of the past. Indeed, a new king who did not know Joseph But for each of those, the offsetting effect of towering figures of faith and service, like Moses. And then never forget what Jesus said about Peter. Sometimes it can feel as though we are going round and round in circles and getting nowhere. But on the other hand, also, there are those people who have great visions, people to whom, perhaps, similar words to these might be spoken. Blessed are you, Simon, son of Jonah, for this was not revealed to you by flesh and blood, but by my Father in heaven. And I tell you that you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades will not overcome it. I will give you the keys of the kingdom. Whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven. What the new king failed to see in the Hebrews was that those who knew Joseph saw that there was a real power, the real presence of God at work. Stephen knew that power. Peter saw that power. That power is there for us too. And to God be honour, glory and praise now and always. Amen.